Hello dear viewers, today's video marks another venture into new territory in terms of content for this channel. Originally, I had planned to start work on a new video on the Behringer Crave, when I realized that the introduction to that video kept getting longer and longer, because I wanted to give a short overview over the whole Behringer synth clone controversy, and where the Crave fits into all of this. Though I thought, as it's a much debated topic, let's try to actually spin this out into its own video. If you are really only here for reviews and demos of disliked and forgotten synths, maybe this is the time to skip to another video. Then, if you are here for an overview over the ever-evolving range of Behringer clones, this is also not the right video for you. As what I'm going to try in this video is explain why Behringer went all in on cloning and what it took them to be able to push out what seems to be an ever-increasing number of classic synth clones. So here we go. Behringer bashing has become pretty en vogue again recently. And while I'm not a fully blown Behringer fanboy, I have to admit that I own quite a lot of Behringer gear, and I think they have created some pretty awesome gear in the last few years. I will however try to stick to the facts only in this video, and sadly they are not all in Behringer's favor, but we'll see at that later on in the video. Ever since Behringer entered the synth market in the mid-2010s, it has been causing quite a stir with its approach of cloning long out of production cult machines. Strictly speaking though, Udi's personal involvement in creating synths is a lot older, and the UB1 was his first synth, personally handcrafted in what he describes as thousands of hours of research and development in 1977, when he was only 16 years old. When Udi started his own company a few years later, he had therefore already learned that creating synths is a very extensive endeavor for any company. And so, for many years, Behringer as a company focused on gear like mixers and other studio equipment that was a lot easier to make and much easier to sell. Interestingly, some of the business practices Behringer is criticized for today were already widely in use in these earlier days of Behringer, but we'll see at that later. While Uli Behringer had steered around building synths for economic reasons, it seemed that he had never really lost interest in creating synths. And starting from probably around the early 2010s, he instructed his engineers to pick up and study some classic synths. In an article I found, it is revealed that Behringer had already been looking into creating a Juno 106 style synth for some time, and there are even some concept renders for this project labeled FAT108. This FAT108 project later turned into the Behringer DeepMind, which was developed over the following years by Behringer's UK team and released in 2016. So Behringer had spent what seems like half a decade to create the DeepMind from the ground up, a truly unique synth for its time, given that it's a real 12-voice analog synth, the first of its kind in what seems the ages. So, many people seem to wonder why today are they just pumping out clone after clone instead of continuing to create their own unique synths like the DeepMind. It's like they gave us a glimpse of what they are capable of and then just decided to troll everyone from this point on. First of all, if you look at the DeepMind story, I guess it's pretty clear that creating something from the ground up is a mammoth task. You have to keep in mind that analog polysynths had, at this point in music history, more or less vanished like 20 years ago. There were some notable exceptions like the Alesis Andromeda and some other attempts, but these really mostly were exotic and very pricey niche products. And while Behringer clearly took inspiration from the Juno 106, it did so in a way car makers do when they release a car inspired by a classic car, working with the concept itself instead of utilizing old tech like carburetors or even more ancient hand cranks in its design. I think it's realistic to say that a lot of the knowledge about how to make analog sound just right, that analog magic, has mostly been lost. Also, most if not all the critical components used in these classic analog polysynths, like VCO and filter chips, are long out of production, and at the same time technology and miniaturization electronics have developed massively. You could try to build analog synths the old-fashioned way, like some enthusiasts and small boutique brands have done and still do, but this type of production would never scale up in a way that would make it profitable for a company the size and ambition of Behringer. Either the synths would be very expensive, or the output numbers would be much too small. It's absolutely certain that the development of the DeepMind was a massive undertaking, and would have been so for any company. And for all the work put into the product, commercially the DeepMind certainly didn't do bad, but it didn't exactly top the sales charts either. An achievement Behringer's later clones achieved with these. Also, it was a Behringer product after all, so it was met with a lot of prejudice and didn't exactly earn a great reputation online. So, is this the reason they resort to mostly only building clones now? Many people seem to think that all you need is some schematics and a factory in China to knock out synth clones, But when Behringer simply clones old synths instead of creating their own products, this is not what is actually happening. Because you can't simply clone old synths by copying the original layout to the original parts all that easily anymore. Instead, what Behringer really does is take the original plans and make a lot of adjustments to make it possible to simply clone a synth that in the end internally varies from the original quite a bit, but, and that's the true magic of Behringer clones, sounds extremely close to the real thing. As some old components are critical to the sound of certain synths, they even went as far as bringing some of the old analog chips from classic synths back into production. In 2000, Behringer acquired chipmaker Cool Audio. Along with the acquisition came the manufacturing capabilities and the IP to bring classic audio chips back into production. These chips are now used in the Behringer clones, but also in other manufacturers' synths. So they just clone stuff technically isn't correct. I'm pretty certain it did again take a considerable investment in money and resources to get to the point where they can now in fact push out monosynth clones relatively fast and in large quantities. Also, it seems they still keep investing in making the same possible for polysynths, drum machines, samplers and whatever else they've announced and or teased since. The second thing we have to look at with all the cloning criticism is the market situation itself. After Behringer had completed the very ambitious DeepMind project, they moved on to simpler projects, namely a ton of monosynths. That were, thanks to the groundwork laid by the DeepMind project and the comparatively much simpler design of monosynths, much easier and faster to develop. Two of the earliest products were the Neutron and the Minimo clone Model D. If you compare how these two performed on the synth market, it becomes more than clear why Behringer has since pushed the cloning route very hard and released a ton of clones of classic monosynths. While they are different in width, both the Model D and the Neutron seem to share a common platform, which was later used for many other monosynth clones. Using a single platform for many products is a strategy commonly used in the automobile sector. Once a technological platform that handles most of the under-the-hood stuff is developed, car makers can adopt this platform to create a large number of different models quickly and cost-effectively, as many parts are reused. The same applies for Behringer's monosynth platform, where things like chassis, power distribution, interfacing, MIDI and most probably many other aspects are unified. While the Neutron is a unique synth design based around the classic 3340 VCO chip that Behringer had just brought back into production, the Model D is a mostly faithful recreation of a cult classic. Looking at Thomann's sales charts again as a reference, I think it's clear that with all the hype the Model D created, it very clearly outsold the Neutron by a wide margin. While Behringer had to convince buyers that the Neutron was the great monosynth it is, Model Ds were selling like hotcakes simply because of the cult status of the original machine. So, zero marketing investment and massive sales. If you were a manager at Behringer, what route would you pick? If your answer is anything but cash in on cult classics, you should probably go find a different job. Yes, the ethics surrounding this business decision, cashing in on another company's product success, are questionable. But if there is a profitable market for something, someone will provide the product and make a ton of money. Just go ask your local crack dealer. And while synths aren't drugs, you all know for some people they actually are. But you may ask, how's this even possible? Just as drug dealers operate outside of the law, how can Behringer get away with taking someone's intellectual property and more or less clone their old synths? Well, the answer to this question is a bit more complicated, but you can basically pin it down to a few key points. First of all, maybe easiest to understand, some of the machines cloned have become what in the software world is called abandonware. Synths like the Cat or the Wasp were made by companies that are long gone. In this case, either no one is left to care, or Behringer might have even been cheeky enough to try and snap up the rights to these names and designs, like they had tried and seemed for a while to have succeeded with the Oberheim brand. Then, basically all of the patents used back then, even for companies that still exist today, are long expired. So it's perfectly legal to borrow these designs for your own creations. In fact, there are whole industries based on borrowing from expired patents, like in the pharmaceutics sector. This, however, mostly only applies for what happens under the hood. You can copy aspirin and sell it, but you cannot call it aspirin or use the logos. So how does Behringer manage to sell what seems to be a straightforward copy of a Roland SH101, for example? While the answer to this question is quite complex again, you can again break it down to that Behringer is walking on a very thin line here. Their designs aren't usually exact copies, but even design rights themselves expire. Also, trademark names and logos can expire when they are not actively taken care of by their trademark holders. Sometimes Behringer can seem like an opponent too big and too expensive to take on for smaller companies. And sometimes, when Behringer truly takes it too far, like when they cloned Roland's guitar pedals a bit too closely, they aim to settle out of court. All in all, like many big corporations, Behringer does what it can get away with. That is quite frankly a lot. As long as the result of Behringer getting away with stuff isn't that whole populations are robbed of their drinking water or entire rainforests are turned into deserts, but cheap synths, most people don't seem to be too annoyed, especially as the output is focused on long out of production gear that would otherwise be out of the reach of most people. For a while now, Behringer has also increasingly focused their attention on gear that is not at all out of production for a long time. Out of what seemed nowhere, they dropped a very direct clone of Arturia's keystep controller, claiming that Arturia itself clones the designs of other companies. And after also entering the Eurek market with much applauded copies of classic modules, they dropped pretty direct clones of famous mutable instrument modules. Even for the most outright defenders of Behringer's cloning approach, these are hard to swallow decisions that come across as very greedy cash-in attempts. Looking at Behringer's own history though, they shouldn't come as any surprise, because it's pretty much what Behringer had pulled off decades ago, when they released mixers that looked a bit too identical to products by other manufacturers. Behringer managed to get away with it then, and will probably do so now, because they have since, and to an extent thanks to many of us buying a lot of Behringer synths, become an absolute mammoth of a company. Behringer's music tribe today is one of the biggest players in the music gear business. Spanning over a dozen or so companies, they cover almost any aspect of the business, from stage to recording to music production. While a lot of this is done through continued ruthless business practice towards the competition, it will be interesting to watch if Behringer will at least keep their friendly face towards the customer. Uli Behringer has often claimed to being very committed to democratizing the access to music gear. In another interview I read, he himself tells the story of how young Uli used his electronic skills to make some money as a teen, fixing gear for other musicians. At one point he opened a defective mix and got really angry at the company making the mixer. Not because it was faulty, but because he realized that this company charged the customer $2,000 for a mixer made of parts worth only $200. This in fact sounds very similar to when he criticized Moog for selling a $4,000 mini Moog that is made of $200 parts on Gearspace. Behringer as a company never get tired to mention that their customers are their number one priority. We hear you and all. And I think it's only fair to say that they've so far really delivered on their promise. Even though it sometimes took years, they managed to push out product after product, and instead of considerably increasing prices in tandem with their success, they've not only slashed prices for some of their existing products, very recently they even announced a €49 mini JP8000 clone. I mean €49, what the hell? It will be very interesting to see where things will go from here. It's not hard to imagine that Behringer will stay successful in the near future and even expand on their growing music tribe empire. They've started Music Tribe Community as their take on gear forums like Modwiggler or Gearspace. They've started their own marketplace as an alternative to Reverb and even announced their own free DAW to lure people even deeper into their music tribe. It's not hard to imagine that at one point Behringer will become something like a music gear monopoly, crushing and snapping up failing competitors left and right. I just really hope Behringer will not end up as a stereotypical monopoly, milking customers to the last drop once they've achieved total dominance over the synth world, or for them to turn into a second Roland, releasing increasingly more uninspired and boring reimaginations of the same old thing over and over again. At the moment, it looks like Behringer is going stronger than ever, teasing and also releasing new synths left and right, delivering on their polysynth promises, introducing new platforms, and at the same time tweaking their existing designs to achieve even better emulation of classic synths. Here's hoping that they will focus on the customer as much as they promise to do now in the future too. And eventually, when all the classics are covered, let the engineers come up with some unique and truly innovative new stuff.